Well, I just keep plugging along in this five greatest players in each NFL team's history. You can check out the rest of the playlist in the description box down below. Today, I'm here to talk about the five greatest Kansas City Chiefs players of all time. This is an organization that dates back to the AFL days where they originally were the Dallas Texans before they moved to Kansas City to become the Chiefs. They've had some good times in their history, but those were long, long ago. They've had a lot of seasons of bad, a lot of seasons of so close yet so far away, and ultimate disappointment. But they have still had some good players throughout their team's history, and this wasn't the easiest list to compile. Had some notable honorable mentions, a few Hall of Famers that didn't make the list, a few other really good players, maybe one or two of them I feel do deserve to have a bust in Canton that didn't make this list either. Some of the honorable mentions, Hall of Famers like Emmett Thomas and Buck Buchanan and Curly Culp that were on those great Chiefs teams of the mid to late 60s and early 70s, along with a Willie Lanier and Otis Taylor, a guy I think you can make some argument for maybe deserving a spot in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Then you look at some of the players of the 80s and 90s and even 2000s, guys like Duron Cherry and Albert Lewis, Dale Carter, Neil Smith, Priest Holmes. These are some very, very good players. Not every player has to be a Hall of Famer to be a really good player. And these are all players that contributed during their time in Kansas City, were very good players, among the best at their positions. But again, ultimately, this list was about determining the five greatest Kansas City Chiefs players of all time. So let's go ahead and get started with this list. At number 5, I've got Will Shields, the third round pick, 74th overall out of Nebraska in the 1993 NFL draft. During his 14 seasons in Kansas City, he was the starter at right guard for 14 years. He was a 12-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time first-team All-Pro. He's been a Hall of Fame finalist the past 3 years, and he'll get his due. He'll get his place in Canton very soon. The last 12 years of his career, he finished the season in the Pro Bowl each and every single time. One of the premier guards and interior linemen of his time, no question. One of the truly great Kansas City Chiefs of all time, and hence why he makes my list at number 5. Number 4, I almost in some ways feel guilty about putting this guy here at number 4 because he was one of my favorite players as a kid. I loved me some Derek Thomas, man. I truly did. And it still breaks my heart the fact that he's been gone as long as he had and meant really such a tragic end to his life. You're talking about the 4th overall pick out of Alabama in that 1989 NFL draft that featured 4 Hall of Famers going in the top 5 picks. Derek Thomas was the closest thing we've had to Lawrence Taylor since Lawrence Taylor. Derek Thomas was a force on the outside. He was the premier edge rusher of his time, the most dominant edge rusher of his time, and I don't think anybody disputes that or questions it in terms of his ability as an outside linebacker in that great Marty Schottenheimer, Gunther Cunningham 3-4 defense. You had to account for him. If you didn't double team him, if you sometimes didn't even triple team him, you were going to regret it and you were going to pay the price. During his 11 seasons in Kansas City, Derek Thomas was a 9-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time first-team All-Pro, ended up being a member of the 1990s NFL All-Decade team. During his career, his 11 seasons, he had 7 seasons of 10 or more sacks. He had a 20-sack season in 1990. He still holds the single-game record for most sacks with 7, and that was also done in 1990. He had 9 straight Pro Bowl appearances to start his career, so every year from 1989 to 1997, including his rookie year of 1989. He was a Pro Bowl member and a legit one, not a joke one. Even more importantly to me, I look at Derek Thomas and his greatness, and you say, how would you put him over a Willie Lanier who won championships, or a Buck Buchanan, or an Emmett Thomas, or a Curly Culp, or so on and so forth? I look at Derek Thomas's impact on the overall organization. After the Hank Stram Chiefs era, there were a lot of lean years for Kansas City, let's face it. There truly were. Marty Schottenheimer comes in 1989. His first draft choice is Derek Thomas. It was a franchise and organization changer. In Derek Thomas's 11 seasons in Kansas City, they had 10 winning seasons and made the playoffs 7 times. You could sit there and talk about this. You could sit there and talk about that. You could sit there and say, well, it's not just strictly because of one player, especially if that player isn't a quarterback. And that may partially be true. But there is no question to me in my mind that Derek Thomas was the player that started the process of really turning the fortunes of the Kansas City Chiefs. He was the player that made them respectable. He was the player that helped make them a formidable force in the AFC in the 1990s. 10 winning seasons in 11 years, 7 playoff appearances. There is no question that Derek Thomas was a major significant contributor and big time impact on reasons why that occurred for the Chiefs organization of the 90s. No question. No question. Definitely belongs in this list. Like I said, I almost feel bad that I couldn't put him higher. Number 3, though, I go with Len Dawson. You talk about a former first-round pick out of Purdue for the Pittsburgh Steelers who didn't pan out in Pittsburgh. They brought in Bobby Lane. They traded him to Cleveland. He wasn't able to beat out Milt Plum in Cleveland, so he ends up getting cut. And then he's brought in by an upstart AFL franchise called the Dallas Texans in 1962. His first season of playing for the Dallas Texans in 1962. They win the AFL championship. He becomes the AFL MVP and basically, effectively, his AFL rookie season. And it was just an indicator of more great things to come for Len Dawson and the Kansas City Chiefs during his 14 years with the franchise. He was a 7-time Pro Bowler slash AFL All-Star, a 2-time AFL All-Pro. He was a 3-time AFL champion in 62, 66, and 69. He led the Chiefs to an impressive victory in Super Bowl IV over Bud Grant and the Minnesota Vikings at a time where people still viewed, even after what happened in Super Bowl III with the Jets and the Colts, they still viewed the NFL as the far superior league and the far superior brand. And this was even more validation for the AFL. In the last game before the official full merger of the AFL and the NFL as one combined entity and league, this was one last salvo for the AFL, and Len Dawson was a big part of that. During his time, he was also very good statistically. He was a 4-time league leader in passing touchdowns, a 6-time league leader in completion percentage, one of the more accurate quarterbacks of the 60s and 70s, no doubt about it, and definitely belongs on this list. He's the best quarterback in the history of the organization. He's the most accomplished quarterback and one of the most accomplished players in the organization's history, and he belongs on this list at number 3. Number 1 and number 2 wasn't that easy for me to do. I almost flip-flopped him, almost. But number 2, I've got Bobby Bell, who was a 56 overall selection in the 7th round out of Minnesota in the 1963 AFL draft. The interesting thing about this to me with Bobby Bell was he was a part of those Minnesota Gopher teams in the early 60s, including the team that won it all, won the national championship in 1960. And he was drafted in the 2nd round of the NFL draft by the Minnesota Vikings, yet chose to sign with the Kansas City Chiefs and play in the AFL instead, even though he was only a 7th round pick for them. And I think Bobby Bell doesn't regret that decision. And I know sure as hell that Hank Stram and everybody involved with the Kansas City Chiefs organization, Lamar Hunt, they never regretted it. And they were thanking their lucky stars that he did choose to play with them, because in his 12 years with the Kansas City Chiefs, he would go on to be thought of as one of the best defensive players of his time, perhaps the premier outside linebacker of his time, and if not one of the greatest outside linebackers in NFL history. A 9-time Pro Bowler, a 6-time first team All-Pro. He made 9 straight AFL All-Star / Pro Bowl appearances between 64 and 72. 6 straight seasons, as an All-Pro between the AFL and NFL between 1965 and 1970. The great thing about Bobby Bell is he actually started, believe it or not, his career at defensive end, played his first 2 years at defensive end, and was a Pro Bowler at defensive end in 1964 before he became a weak side linebacker, one of the truly great weak side linebackers of all time. So he's a Pro Bowler at both defensive end and outside linebacker, a member of the NFL's 1970s all-decade team, a member of 2 AFL championship teams at 66 and 69, and was a part of that Super Bowl championship team in 1969 that beat the Vikings in Super Bowl IV. Bobby Bell, it could definitely be argued, is the best player in the history of the Kansas City Chiefs. And to me, he was the best player on those Hank Stram Chiefs teams of the 60s and 70s. But I think the greatest Kansas City Chief of all time, actually, it sounds like just finished up his career in 2013. Not with the Chiefs, mind you, but I think beyond question, to me, the number 1 Kansas City Chief player of all time, the most dominant player at his position of all time, the best player at his position of all time, and therefore the best Kansas City Chief of all time is Tony Gonzalez. Think about this. He was the 13th overall selection out of California in the 1997 NFL draft. There was some question about whether he loved football more or whether he loved basketball more and how his skills as a basketball player were going to transition over to the NFL. Well, transition they did. In his 12 seasons in Kansas City, Tony Gonzalez made the Pro Bowl in all but 2 of those seasons. He was a 10-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time first-team All-Pro, beyond question, the tight end of the decade of the 2000s. When you look at his numbers just from a Kansas City Chiefs standpoint, I'm not even putting in the last 5 years that he played with the Atlanta Falcons. Just looking at his numbers that he compiled and he amassed and put up during his 12 seasons in Kansas City. During his time with the Chiefs, he had 900, and 16 career receptions. That alone made him the all-time leader and still has him as the all-time leader among tight ends for most career receptions, not even factoring in the last 5 years of his career. His 10,940 career receiving yards as a Kansas City Chief are still ranked number one amongst tight ends of all time, and again, not factoring in the last 5 years of his career in Atlanta. His 76 receiving touchdowns as a tight end ranks second all time behind Antonio Gates. And that's, again, just 76 receiving touchdowns as a Kansas City Chief, not even factoring in the last 5 years of his career with the Atlanta Falcons. He was a member of the 2000s NFL All-Decade team. I think beyond question, he is the greatest, most accomplished tight end in NFL history, one of the truly great dominant players over an extended period of time in the history of the organization. Imagine the numbers that Tony Gonzalez would have put up if he had a better quarterback than a Trent Green or a Heward throwing to him for all those years. Just think about that. What could he have accomplished? I think it was 2008, wasn't it? Tyler Thigpen was the leading passer for the Kansas City Chiefs. Those are the type of quarterbacks that Tony Gonzalez had. So that, to me, if anything, speaks to his greatness, to true greatness. Without the great weapons outside at wide receiver, without the great quarterback, he was still able to become the preeminent tight end of his time and the preeminent tight end in NFL history. A true game changer, no question about it, and one of the all-time greats ever. And that, to me, is what gives him the edge over Bobby Bell and what makes, in my opinion, Tony Gonzalez the greatest Kansas City Chief of all time. As always, you're welcome to chime in with your thoughts on my list. Let me know what your top five would be, what you think of mine, good, bad, or otherwise, all in the comments down below. I think next up is going to be the Miami Dolphins. I'm getting closer to the finish line, about halfway there. Got a little bit more road to hoe this month, though.